Hey everyone, I'm Jordan Boostmaster. I am a filmmaker and I'm also a mountain biker. I have been using every single GoPro camera since the Hero 2. I know pretty much everything that there is to know about GoPro cameras. I'm going to give you a very in-depth tutorial on every feature in the GoPro camera because some of these functions don't quite operate the way that you might expect, and I've learned that through testing, specifically when it comes to the flat mode or compared to the GoPro color profile. This tutorial video is for everyone. It's for the amateurs, the beginners who have no experience with filmmaking or anything like that, and it's also for the professionals who know everything about filmmaking but want to use GoPros and want to use GoPros the best. Plus the fact that I am a filmmaker myself. I went to school for filmmaking. I know everything about how these cameras work, especially with my experience with GoPros. And so with the information that I'm going to present to you, you're going to be able to make better videos with your GoPros, get better quality footage, and I'm going to explain to you how. There will be times when you will want to use slightly different settings than what I use for certain situations, and I'm going to explain what those situations would be and why. And there are times when you'd always want to be using the same settings as me because they're just objectively the best. But this video is all about the Hero 4 Black Edition and how to get the greatest footage that you possibly can with this camera. And I go the most in depth when it comes to the white balance options, as well as the flat mode, and as well as the exposure compensation. Those are kind of the biggest, most in-depth functions. Okay, so let's start with the resolution. This is pretty simple. Just choose the highest resolution that you want, obviously, because it will give you the best clarity. But of course, you're going to be limited in the frame rates. Starting with the highest resolution is 4K. So 4K is 3840 by 2160, and there's the super view option. So now there's 2.7K, which is 2704 by 1520, which is a really random resolution. Okay, so now we got some 4:3 ratio, 2704 by 2028. So obviously you just see more on the tops and bottoms. You do see just a little bit more on the sides. Okay, so now we got the 1440 4:3 option, which is just 1920 by 1440. We got the 1080 super view mode, regular 1920 by 1080. We got the 960 4:3 option, which is 1280 by 960. And the 720 mode, 1280 by 720, and there's super view and the regular mode. And then we got the standard definition, which is just titled WVGA. I don't know what that stands for, but it's 848 by 480, that's standard definition. And here is just all the resolutions just kind of scaled up to the same size. So you just can kind of see the difference here between all the resolutions. There's the clarity difference here. So obviously you just want to record the highest resolution that you can. That's pretty simple, obviously. It will limit what kind of frame rate you're going to use, but if you just wanted to use 30 frames, then you can use any of these resolutions. Okay, so one thing I want you guys to understand is the super view mode. It's just the 4:3 video squished down into a 16:9 aspect ratio. That's all it is, okay? So you look at the difference between the 4:3 and the super view, and you see the exact same amount of stuff on the tops and bottoms and on the sides. There's no difference. It's just that the super view mode squishes the 4:3 down into a 16:9 size. That's all that super view mode is. So I personally like to shoot in 4K 30 frames as much as possible, but you can't do super view mode at 30 frames. You can only do super view mode at 24 frames. So then I use 2.7K super view mode at 30 frames a second. But then what if I want 60 frames? Well, then I can't use super view anymore. I can use regular 2.7K at 60 frames. So if I want both super view and 60 frames per second, well, then I have to go down to 1080. And I actually rarely do that. So all my 2.7K videos I create into 1440p videos. So that is 2560 by 1440. That's the resolution I actually use when I film the 2.7K resolution. Okay, so now let's talk about frames per second. I mean, this is pretty simple. It's just, 30 frames is the regular frame rate that I always record on. All like movies, like Hollywood movies, they're all at 24 frames per second. So if you're making something, some kind of like a dramatic production, yeah, 24 frames is great. But if we're talking about like POV footage of, you mountain biking like me, I don't ever bother with 24 frames. I only use 30 frames or 60 frames. course, 60 frames is nice for slow motion, or if I want to just upload in 60 frames per second on YouTube, then that's kind of nice. Now you can also do 120 frames per second at 1080, which I very rarely ever use because I just don't really need that kind of slow motion, at least on POV videos. So I personally don't really use it. So I need you to understand that the main reason why I actually choose a certain frame rate, whether it's 30 frames or 60 frames, actually has more to do with how much light there is, because it'll affect the shutter speed. See, when I record at 30 frames per second at 4K, which is what I'd like to record a lot of times because I don't really need 60 frames as much and I like the higher resolutions, the problem is that if it's a little bit dark enough, the shutter speed is going to go slow enough that the video is actually going to get really blurry, full of motion blur, because the shutter speed is going to be too slow. So when you have 30 frames per second, the slowest the shutter speed can go is 1/30th of a second. And that's really slow for this video. It is definitely not good. So sometimes I'll have to choose to record at 60 frames a second just because I know that it's going to be a little bit darker. Like say if it's cloudy out and I'm in the trees, then yeah, you want to use 60 frames per second so that you can force the shutter speed to be a minimum of 1/60th of a second. The shutter speed can never go slower than the frame rate. It's just impossible. And since I don't like such mushy looking footage, then yeah, I'm forced to record in the lower resolutions at the 60 frames per second, even if I don't even need 60 frames per second, just because there's no option on these cameras to limit the shutter speed. Now there has been a new option that has been released lately where you can actually manually set the shutter speed. I'm going to go into that later on in this video. So here I have some footage where I'm on the North Shore. It's sunny out, it's a beautiful day, but it's pretty heavily treed. And I thought that there was still enough light to record at 30 frames per second at 4K, but the shutter speed still does seem a little on the slow end. So I was thinking, shoot, I probably should have still done 2.7K at 60 frames a second because it does look a little bit mushy. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure if 60 frames per second would have made a difference because I just don't know what the shutter speed actually is. So it is hard to say. Maybe the shutter speed was fast enough anyway. It's just hard to say. But I do know as a general rule, if it's cloudy out and you're going in the trees, then yeah, you're gonna want 60 frames per second because otherwise it'll just be too dark and then shutter speed will go all the way down to 1/30th of a second, and that's no good. Okay, so one thing I need you guys to understand, the way that these cameras expose, there are 3 ways of exposing video. There's the f-stop, there's the shutter speed, and there's the ISO. We're gonna get into the ISO later on, but the f-stop is a fixed f-stop on these GoPro cameras. It's fixed at f2.8. So that means you can never change the f-stop. It never automatically changes. So the only 2 ways that it adjusts for different exposures is by changing the shutter speed and changing the ISO. Okay, those are the only 2 ways it adjusts for different lighting conditions. And what I have found is that it first lowers the shutter speed all the way down as far down as it can go, and then after that, then it will raise the ISO if it's still dark enough. So that means your shutter speed is gonna go too slow, like slow enough that there's gonna be a lot of motion blur before it then finally raises the ISO to brighten it again. Meaning by the time that it's raising the ISO, your footage is already so blurry that it almost doesn't even matter that it raises the ISO. Now that's just what GoPros decided to do for their camera. But what you can do is you can force the shutter speed to not go too slow by changing the frame rate, because the shutter speed cannot go any slower than what the actual frame rate is, right? So if you're filming at 4K 30 frames and you're in dark situation, it's just kind of not worth it at all. It's much better to record at the lower resolution at the higher frame rate, even if you don't need the higher frames, just because it forces the shutter speed to be at a minimum 60th of a second. Or obviously there are some higher frame rate options like 120 frames per second at 1080, some 80 frames per second in some options. So I really wish that there was a way of like limiting the shutter speed, just like how there's an ISO limit where the ISO will go from, you know, the lowest all the way up to your limit. But unfortunately there is no option for that. So the only way of limiting your shutter speed is by actually changing the frame rate itself, which is just annoying because that forces me to shoot in lower resolutions than I want. Anyway, so that's just how that works. Okay, let's move on to field of view. Field of view is a very simple setting. I always use the wide setting. There's wide, medium, and narrow. Then there's also super view mode, which I already kind of touched on in the resolution section. But basically out of the wide, medium, and narrow, I always use wide. So basically the difference between wide, medium, and narrow is just that it crops in. That's all it does. GoPros don't actually zoom in or anything. All it's doing is cropping in. So basically what that means is you could do it yourself if you wanted, right? So you could film in a higher resolution yourself at the wide field of view, which captures everything, and then you can just crop in yourself however you like. So you could recreate your own medium or narrow field of view if you want. So I'm just going to show you my own version of cropping it in myself. Okay, so here I have the wide field of view. I'm just going to zoom in to recreate the narrow field of view, just to show you that you can create the exact same look just by scaling it in your editing program. You just have to scale in about 192% in your editing program, and then it'll get the exact same kind of framing that the narrow field of view produces. So I only use the wide field of view because medium and narrow crops it in, and you can just recreate the medium and narrow yourself by using a higher resolution and a wide field of view. So really, there's not much of a reason to film in narrow field of view, and that's pretty much all there is to say about field of view. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the low light option, because there's not much to say other than it's useless. I never use it, and I do not recommend you to ever use it. In case you don't understand how it works, what it does is you can only use it when you have a frame rate that is higher than 30 frames per second, because when you film at a higher frame per second, it can then have the option to change to a lower frame rate. Now what happens when you change to a lower frame rate is it allows the shutter speed to also open up a bit. It allows the shutter speed to slow down a bit to whatever that frame rate is, meaning it can go brighter because the shutter speed is slower. But why don't you just choose your own frame rate and just choose based on that? You know, as we were already talking about the frame rate options there, you might as well just choose your own frame rate and then let it be that, because if you're gonna do low light option, it defeats the purpose of filming at 60 frames, because then you don't even always know what is 60 frames, and because the shutter speed won't be locked at a minimum 60th of a second, because it can now go up to a 30th of a second when it feels that it's low enough light. I just don't get why the purpose of this is even here. Like I just don't even get why this option even exists. I think it's really dumb. It's stupid. Don't bother using it. It's useless. Just choose your own frame rate. So back when I had the Hero 3 Black Edition, and also with the Hero 2, I would use spot meter on actually, because I would always notice how kind of overexposed certain things were, and I wanted some way to darken them. So I would actually use spot meter because there was no exposure compensation option on those cameras yet. So as you can see here, this is the Hero 4 using spot meter, and of course you can easily see when the spot meter is on, it is darker, more properly exposed for this particular shot compared to spot meter being off. It's just certain things are a little too bright and it's just a bit weird looking. Now spot meter though, it doesn't really always work because it's mostly just looking at the center kind of portion of the screen to expose rather than looking at the whole image. So that means if the middle part of the image is a bit darker, it's going to brighten it as opposed to darken it. So spot meter, I was pretty happy with using it on the Hero 3 Black Edition, but exposure compensation is definitely a superior way of making sure that it's always darker, because that's what I want. I want every single shot to always be darker than the camera would normally want it to be. Alright, so when it comes to Pro Tune, I recommend that everyone use Pro Tune mode. I always use Pro Tune. There's no reason for me to not use Pro Tune, because even if you don't want to color correct your footage, even if you don't know much about cameras, I am going to tell you what kind of features you can use that's going to still get you better quality footage while not needing to do any color correction or do any kind of adjustments in post. But one of the first benefits to using Pro Tune mode is that it actually gives you a higher bit rate, which is really great. That just means better quality footage. So that's a good reason for why you should use Pro Tune. It just makes it a little bit better quality. And then within Pro Tune, there's a whole lot of options, and you can just use the auto white balance or whatever white balance you want. I'll talk about that later. So basically, I think there is no reason to not use Pro Tune. I think that everyone should be using Pro Tune because it's just better quality footage. You have more options. And if you don't understand those options, then just keep watching and I'll explain all of those options to you. But basically, yeah, I use Pro Tune mode. I recommend everyone use Pro Tune mode for whether you can do color correction or whether you can't do color correction. I'm going to help you to learn exactly what you should do. Okay, so when it comes to white balance, this is kind of a big subject just because there's a lot of test footage that I've done to really show the difference, and I've really become convinced that yeah, native white balance is easily, objectively the best white balance, but the downside is you have to color correct it. That is the only downside. If you can't color correct, then native white balance is not for you. Then I would recommend auto white balance. So I'm just showing you the differences between all of these white balances. Auto 3000 is for tungsten light bulbs, like for indoor bulbs. 5500 is for daylight. 6500 is more for like cloudy or like shade kind of situations. Native white balance is the best. It's where you have to color correct it though. So comparing my native white balance color correction to the 5500K white balance, which is supposed to be the, you know, the daylight white balance, I think you can agree, at least I certainly think, that my color corrected native white balance is way better looking than the 5500K white balance. I'm just really not a fan of the auto white balance, to be honest. Let me show you a pretty good example of why I hate auto white balance on these cameras. Look at this clip. It just shifts around a bunch. It goes colder, warmer, colder, warmer. I mean, there's a lot of like sunlight and shadow, so it will kind of confuse the camera in this clip. You can just see it kind of shifting from cold to warm pretty quickly. And that's just what you get with auto white balance when you're in so much light and shadow. It's like the camera doesn't know what it's doing. I have a lot of comparisons to show you between my native white balance with color correction compared to auto white balance here. Some footage on the North Shore, on Mount Frome. There's a trail called Bobsled. Just showing you the colors you get with native white balance when you color correct compared to auto white balance. It's just not as good when you do auto white balance. It's just kind of colder looking. The dirt maybe a bit more purplish. The greens are kind of meh, kind of weird. I don't know. I just don't like the colors honestly with auto white balance. I think they're crap. Here's some 6500K white balance footage. That may sound like a good accurate white balance, and maybe it is for these situations because it's like all cloudy and kind of rainy. Except, like I said before, I'm just not really a fan of the colors that are produced by these GoPro cameras. But I am a huge fan of what native white balance gives you. I think this is way better when you color correct, that is. That's the whole downside. You have to be able to color correct your footage. And so I think this is just way better than anything that the auto white balance will ever do, or any manually set white balance. Just some more test footage between 5500K and native, just showing the difference again. When I film with my regular camera, and if it's sunny out, even though I'm in the trees, I usually do white balance for the daylight. And just like I also usually expose for the sunlight as well, meaning the darks go dark. So it's kind of like I'm only focusing on the daylight. That is when I'm filming with my regular Panasonic GH4. I'm just doing a bunch of tests here between how my GoPro Hero 4 compares to my Panasonic GH4. So this is just so you can see how these cameras operate differently. The auto white balance between a GH4 and a GoPro Hero 4. Certainly a noticeable difference in those colors. You can definitely tell like the reds are just different on the GoPros. The greens are just different. There's like more purplish pink in the reds on the GoPro compared to the GH4. The GH4 has much better colors than what the GoPro comes up with. You know, here's 6500, and it's just, again, like you can just tell that the colors are definitely different, and I'm not really a fan of what GoPro comes up with. I'm just a huge fan of native white balance. You can get such good colors. Like, I'm really impressed with the colors that you can get with native white balance. It's beautiful. So that is easily the best white balance if you can color correct. If you cannot color correct, I would just recommend just going with auto. But for me, who strives for the best visual quality possible, I need native white balance. Now, there is a downside to native white balance. Aside from the fact that you have to color correct, there is the fact that you get some artifacts, and they are ugly. They're not the most noticeable things ever, but if you look at these images, especially in the gray tones, that's where I noticed it the most. Look at in the gray tones, you see all these weird blocks of purplish, maybe yellow, maybe there might be some bluish blocks or greenish, purple, magenta kind of stuff. That's the thing that just pisses me off about it. I want good colors, and you do get good colors with native white balance, but at the same time, you get some of this digital artifacting where you get these weird blocky, inaccurate colors for certain splotches, and it's just ugly. So that's certainly something I hope can improve more on the future GoPro cameras. I consider white balance to be honestly one of the bigger, more important options, just because that's what gives my GoPro footage such a nice colored look, because I use native white balance and I color correct it, and that makes it look so much nicer than if it was auto white balance. So yeah, like I said, if you can't color correct anything, just do auto white balance. If you can color correct, definitely use native white balance. It's so much better. Okay, so let's talk about color profile. Now this is actually a pretty important thing to understand. So first of all, the idea behind color profile, first of all, has nothing to do with color. It only has to do with the contrast, basically. That's all that it is. It just has to do with kind of the highlights, the shadows, the contrast. Has nothing to do with color at all. So the idea is that flat mode would give you a higher dynamic range. That's what GoPro says. Dynamic range is great for, you know, seeing more detail in the shadows and in the highlights, which is great. So I always like to use flat mode. But then with testing, I finally understood that it did not work the way that I expected it to work. So the idea is that the flat mode will give you a higher dynamic range, which means that you're supposed to see more detail in the shadows and in the highlights. So then that means the GoPro color option kind of has a higher contrast, and GoPro color looks exactly the same as if you turn Pro Tune off. As you can see, it doesn't change anything to do with colors at all. It only changes the contrast, basically. That's all that it does. This is where I really learned something very valuable and very important about GoPros that I wish I knew even sooner, but thankfully I know now, and now I'm got to tell you guys. Now I always use the flat mode because I love having a higher dynamic range. I think that's great. As you can see in these shots, you know, it definitely is less of a contrast compared to GoPro color, right? Okay, so now what I'm about to show you is the problem that I discovered while doing these tests. What I discovered is that flat mode only brightens the shadows and it does nothing to the highlights at all. This is a problem, and I wish I knew about this sooner. It's not that big of a problem because of what I'll tell you about in a second, but the fact is, when you go between GoPro color and flat mode, you can see the waveform monitor there. The only difference between these clips is the shadows, and then of course maybe the midtones get a bit brighter with flat mode. But the point is, the highlights stay the same. And that's really important to understand here, because I always thought that I was getting a higher dynamic range in both the highlights and the shadows when I was using this for quite a while. And what ended up happening was that all my footage was just so bright, and I was just like kind of annoyed by how bright it was. I was like, oh man, this is weird how bright my footage is. Like back when I was using the original Hero 3, all this footage is so bright. Like the shadows are so bright and the highlights are also still so bright, and I'm using flat mode, and I thought, man, I thought that this should give me like a higher dynamic range, and then what I had to do is just darken the video so much, and it was so frustrating. Like why is it going so bright? I mean, flat mode should be giving you a higher dynamic range in the highlights and the shadows, but now that I've discovered this, it only increases the dynamic range in the shadows. It only brightens the shadows. That's all that it does. So as you can see with these waveforms, just so you can really see the difference, that's how it works. It just brightens the shadows, and then the midtones are a little bit brighter. So essentially the whole image is a bit brighter. That's all that happens when you use the flat mode, right? And so that's really kind of frustrating when you're trying to get a bigger dynamic range and you don't want your highlights to be overexposed all the time. So then this is where the exposure compensation, or the EV comp as it's called in the GoPro, comes in very, very handy, and it's absolutely essential. And exposure compensation is absolutely essential to use when you use the flat mode. You have to use it pretty much. So what I do is I use flat mode combined with a -1 exposure compensation, okay? Now I'm gonna go more into detail about the exposure compensation later on in this video. But for now, just so you know, I use -1 exposure compensation combined with flat mode, and that gives you a true higher dynamic range in both the highlights and in the shadows. So you can just see some kind of comparisons. When you do 0 exposure compensation, then normal flat mode, it's just brighter, of course. And then when you do GoPro color, you know, the shadows just go darker. But then what about when you do a -1 exposure compensation, like I told you I do in flat mode? Then the highlights get darker, and then the shadows are still a little bit brighter than when they were in the GoPro color mode. And so what happens is you just get a higher dynamic range. So it's a combination of flat mode and -1 exposure compensation. So here you can just see the waveform again, -1 exposure compensation on flat mode, which is the setting I use. Look at the waveform compared to 0 exposure compensation with GoPro Color. You can see that you truly get an increase in dynamic range in both the highlights and in the shadows. And you can see in the waveform monitor, you really get more detail, especially in the highlights. Okay, so let's just review here. The color profile has nothing to do with color, only to do with contrast, or really just to do with the shadows essentially. The flat mode just gives you a brighter shadows and a little bit brighter midtones. The GoPro Color has the same contrast that you get when you have Pro Tune turned off. And when you combine the flat mode with the EV Comp -1, that's when you actually get an increase in dynamic range, both in the highlights and in the shadows. And that's basically one of the key things of how I get great looking footage, in addition to having the native white balance for great colors. Those are basically the 3 key ingredients for how I get really great footage. Okay, so let's talk about the manual shutter option right now. I actually don't really ever use it because the problem is it's not a limiter or any kind of a minimum or a maximum like I wish it was. So like with the ISO limit, you can choose how high the ISO goes up to. Like I limit mine up to 400 and it just ranges all between 100 and 400. But the thing with shutter speed is you're not choosing any minimum or maximum, you're just choosing an exact shutter speed to have it set at. So you have the option for a 30th of a second, 60th of a second, 120th or 240th, and it just is locked at that setting, which can be useful. But when you're doing like POV footage and you're going between, you know, brights and darks, sunlight and shadows, I want my exposure to really be able to change for the different situations. And if I keep the shutter speed at one shutter speed, it's going to be great for certain situations, but way too bright or possibly way too dark for other situations. So for example, when you are out in the daylight, and if you set your shutter speed pretty much at any of these options, even at 240th, it's still going to be too bright. So you need to let your shutter speed go a lot faster to properly expose for daylight settings when you're out in the daylight. So basically, I don't use this manual shutter option. I just have it set to auto because I don't like the fact that you're just choosing a locked in setting. I would much rather have there be like a minimum setting, like a minimum shutter speed, like say, don't go any slower than a 60th of a second. But unfortunately, they don't have that option. But oh well, that's just what they do. So I don't use it. I just have it set to auto. All right, so let's just talk about the ISO limit here. So first of all, just so we understand, it's just a limiter. It doesn't mean that it's actually set at that ISO. It just means when you limit your ISO to 400, which I usually always do, that only means that it will be from a range between 100 to 400 ISO, 100 being the lowest that it can go. Just so that you understand how ISO works, the lower the number, the darker it is, but also the cleaner the image is. So as you brighten your ISO, so as you get a higher number ISO, that means it'll brighten the image, but it also makes it more grainy, so that's the downside. So I limit my ISO to 400 pretty much always. Pretty much no matter what, I always limit it to 400 unless it's like really dark out. So here I'm in the garage, which it is pretty dark, and you can see when you limit to 400, it's at its max at 400 obviously because it's trying to go brighter and it may not look that bad. And then as you let the limit go up to 1600, it takes advantage of that and it tries to go brighter because the camera wants to go brighter. But to be honest, when you look at the 400 ISO, was it really that bad? I mean, it was darker, it was a little bit cleaner, but it was also kind of more accurate in its exposure. So now the difference between 1600 ISO and 6400 ISO limit is not really anything. There's not really any difference because it doesn't need to go that high. Just to show you that it's just a limiter. And the thing is, like, this footage is just so grainy. It just looks so bad. So I don't like letting it go so bright like that. So that's one reason why I just let it be at 400. So here you can just see a difference between 4K recording and 1080 recording. It's cleaner looking when it's at 4K. You can definitely tell a difference. It's much more muddier, mushier. Doesn't look as good when you're recording at 1080 compared to 4K recording. So just so you can see some quick mountain biking shots, look at this tunnel. Now it was cloudy out, so it wasn't the brightest, so it may not be the best example, but at 400 ISO, it allows the tunnel to go really dark because it was dark in there. And you can still see detail outside the tunnel. So it's not blown out white, which maybe normally you would see. It would just be pure white because it would try to expose for in the tunnel. But limiting it to only 400 ISO, that's the brightest that this camera can possibly go. And honestly, that's perfectly fine with me because I think it looks accurate. It looks good. Like, it really is dark in that tunnel. So why would I try to change that, right? Here we have 1600 ISO. So I'm allowing it to get brighter in the tunnel. Now this is a sunnier day, so it's a little bit different, not the best example. But you can see how much brighter it goes in that tunnel because the ISO is now allowing the camera to go that bright. But do you need it to be that bright? That's the question you need to ask yourself. Do you need it to be so bright? Because I personally do not want it to be so bright. Pretty much, yeah, 400 ISO is perfect for me. I never change it other than that. Okay, so here I'm just gonna show you some really dark footage. Like, it's actually really dark. This is on the North Shore on Cypress Mountain, and the sun is definitely setting. 400 ISO limit. That's actually accurate to how dark it really was. Like, it was actually getting almost too dark to ride. And so this footage is actually pretty accurate to how it actually looked to my own eyes, to be honest. You could say, yeah, let it go up to a brighter ISO. Sure, it would become a bit brighter. It would become a bit more grainy. It's just up to you what you want, honestly. So now we were shuttling at Cypress, so we still went for another ride even after that. It was already getting really dark, and now it was getting like seriously dark. And I was like, you know what, let's boost it up to 800 ISO limit. Let's see how that footage looks. So just take a look at what this looks like. It pretty much looks just as dark as the previous footage because it was getting a bit darker. Combined with the fact the ISO went brighter still, it still looks the same because it was getting darker again. It was like probably like half an hour, 40 minutes later. The sun is now behind the horizon. Like, it's getting really dark. So in these situations, if you did have a higher ISO limit, yes, it would certainly go brighter and it would be more grainy. But to be honest, is that really necessary? Because it was so dark anyway, I would just never expect that footage to be usable anyway. So just forget it, you know? Okay, so now we're gonna talk about sharpness. So basically, I use my sharpness at low. You can do high, medium, low. High is like the standard kind of default setting. So when you don't use Pro Tune mode, it's just automatically set to a high sharpness. But when you have high sharpness, honestly, I think it's too high of sharpness. Like, it's just not realistic. It's not a nice, elegant looking image when it's too high. It just looks like fake sharpness because, well, it is fake sharpness, honestly. So I always have it at low. Here's just some examples, seeing what the difference is between high, medium, and low. I should mention, I actually do increase the sharpness a little bit in post on my footage. So here's just some more shots showing high, medium, and low. Here I'm just zooming in on those same shots, just zooming in at about 200% or so, just so you can see a closer view exactly how it looks between high, medium, and low. So then now what I wanted to do is actually compare it to what my Panasonic GH4 does. I wanted to show you the comparison so you can kind of see how they compare in terms of sharpness between the GH4 and the GoPro Hero 4. My GH4, I have it at like a medium sharpness. Like, I don't change the sharpness any lower or higher from its standard setting. So the standard setting for sharpness of the GH4, I would say, is most similar to the low sharpness of the GoPro Hero 4. Basically, I think when you have sharpness up in camera, it can have the potential to cause some little artifacting maybe. So I just have it on the lowest to reduce any potential for certain artifacts, and then I just boost the sharpness a little bit in post. I think it works pretty well. Okay, so now let's talk about exposure compensation. So as I already told you in the color profile segment, I use -1 exposure compensation, which is also called the EV comp in the camera. So as you look at these clips here, I'm just showing you the difference between -0.5 and the -1. I actually used to use -0.5 when I was using the Hero 3 Plus. And then when I got the Hero 4, I was testing -1, and I realized that was totally better because then you get even more detail in the highlights. The highlights are not as bright, and it's certainly not too dark. And so I was very happy with -1, so that's what I use now. So let's just take a look at what they all look like from -2 all the way up to +2 with GoPro color on, auto white balance. Basically looks the same as if you have Pro Tune turned off, but then just, you know, brighter or darker. I would never use anything above 0 because I would say that these cameras get things too bright anyway. Like I said, I always use -1 combined with flat mode, as I already told you about. And now let's take a look at the flat mode with the exposures, just like how I use flat mode, and you can see how the different exposures look. -2 honestly doesn't even look that bad. I use -1 usually for my shots. And 0 I think is just too bright. And obviously above 0 is just way too bright. There's never any reason to use that. So again, to kind of reiterate my choice for using flat mode with -1 combined with the native white balance, this is kind of how my footage looks compared to if you have Pro-Tune turned off and just use the regular default settings. I think that my settings definitely look way better. The colors are better, the exposures are better, more detail on the highlights and the shadows. I just think it looks way better in my opinion. So that's why I use those settings. The thing I want you guys to know is pretty much any camera, when it's set to automatic exposure, it basically always exposes things brighter than you should expose them. That's pretty much true for every camera, not just GoPro. It's pretty much every single camera. Every camera wants to expose things in a brighter way than you actually should. And so that's why -1 exposure is so good. And that's why I'm so happy that this exists in these cameras. It's such a great setting. It's like one of my favorite settings combined with the flat mode and native white balance. Like, oh man, I love this. Like, those are the 3 best settings in these cameras. As I said, of course, I was annoyed by how flat mode only brightens the shadows, but that's when you can combine it with the exposure comp, and then you can really make a great dynamic range, and then it looks great. Now, there is one more benefit to using exposure compensation to darken the image. In addition to getting a proper exposure, you're also speeding up the shutter speed as well. Here I just have a few test shots to really show what the shutter speed is. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but you can see by the amount of blur there is in these little test shots here. Setting at 0 exposure comp, -1 and -2, you can see the amount of motion blur that exists. Combined with the fact that it already just looks like a better exposure, as you darken it, there's also less motion blur, because what it's doing is it's speeding up the shutter speed. That is the way that it darkens it up. Because as I think I've already mentioned earlier on this video, the f-stop is a fixed f2.8. The ISO is the last thing it changes to change the exposure. And the shutter speed is the main way that the camera changes its exposure, is by changing the shutter speed. So that means as you darken the image, it's doing that because it's speeding up the shutter speed, meaning less motion blur, and that is a good thing, especially when certain shots can get too slow of a shutter speed and then it looks mushy and crappy. Having a faster shutter speed is definitely a good thing. Sometimes it might even be nice to record in a -2 exposure comp. So far I'm pretty happy with -1, but sometimes -2 even might be good, or -1.5. And as you can see, there's a noticeably less motion blur with the -2. Here's just some other little tests. Riding the same piece of trail, you can see all those sunspots. Everything is too bright as well as motion blurry. And then when you record -1 exposure, it gets darker because of the faster shutter speed, which also means less motion blur in addition to there being a nicer exposure. It might not be the most noticeable thing in these video clips, but the fact that it's darker is the really nice thing, as well as the fact that the shutter speed is faster. It makes it just a win-win. There's no downside to using -1 exposure comp combined with flat mode. It's just completely win-win as long as you want that extra dynamic range. Sometimes you may even want to use a -1.5 or even -2 depending on the circumstance, but -1 is generally a very solid option combined with flat mode. So let's review. For exposure compensation, if you're going to use flat mode, you have to use exposure compensation at least -0.5 at least, because flat mode only brightens it. I use a -1 exposure compensation because it looks much better than 0, especially when combined with flat mode. You have to darken your image so that you can actually get a higher dynamic range. Exposure compensation darkens the image by raising the shutter speed, which means there's less motion blur, so that's another win. If you use GoPro color as opposed to flat mode, then exposure compensation might not be right for you, because then it might just darken those darks too much, meaning making a lot of black dark shadows, but you can try that out yourself. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed my video. Give me a comment, tell me what you think, give a like and subscribe. I've got a Facebook page and an Instagram page, check those out. And I'm also selling shirts on my Spreadshirt store. And if you haven't already, make sure you guys subscribe for more videos.